I've said before on this channel that there's two ways to process wild clay. I prefer the dry process method, and that's how I process most of my clay because I think it cuts down on labor. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for every clay. And in this case, I'm using a clay from up in northern Arizona that just seems to resist grinding. It grinds okay, but it gums up the grinder real bad. So I'm gonna wet process a batch of clay. I thought this would be a great opportunity to show you the full process of how I wet process clay. It's not that dry processing clay is that much less labor. It's less labor in some areas and it's more in others. It's just a decision I've made to pick which labor I'd rather do or which labor is less laborious to me. When it comes to grinding, dry processing, I've got to grind this whole bucket of clay, and that is a lot of work. But in the wet processing, I can just stick it in a bucket of water, let it soak for a while, mix it up with a drill mixer. That's pretty easy. Then I need to pass it through a strainer to make sure I get all the sticks and rocks out of it, which is fairly easy as well. But then I've got to stick it in a pillowcase or some way to let it dry and let that moisture come out of it. And here's where the labor comes in. Well, first of all, it takes a while. It can take, depending on the weather where you live, it can take days or even weeks for that clay to become usable, to dry out to the point that it's usable. And I don't like waiting that long, first of all. When I want clay, I want to be able to mix up clay and use it the same day. And that's not possible with this method unless you have some more efficient way of drying out your clay. The real labor comes in after that. Once the clay is dry enough that you can knead it and it becomes plastic, then you have to add the temper. And then I've got to make sure it's kneaded throughout that clay, which requires a whole lot of wedging or kneading of that clay mass. And that right there is the work that I'm saving on the dry process. Because when I dry process, I can just put the clay and the temper in one bucket and then just pour them back and forth between two buckets, and in a matter of very little time, the temper and the clay are all fully mixed together. Way less work than kneading that temper through a wet mass, which is a lot of labor. So that's why I choose dry process. This particular clay is just kind of resistant. It gums up my grinder. And you could do it. You could grind it. I mean, I have ground some. But you end up having to open the grinder up and clean it out every once in a while. It's kind of a lot of work getting it through there. Sometimes it gums up and you have to kind of force the handle around. So I'm going to try wet processing it, see if it's a little easier. If this works out for me well today, then I will process it for my Labor Day workshop in the same manner. Once my clay is all dissolved in the water and it's a thin, milky substance, not thick like ice cream or like a milkshake, I'm ready for the next step, which is filtering out the rocks and sticks and leaves, anything else that's in my clay. These paint strainer bags are perfect. They're almost like they're made for processing clay. They're really inexpensive. You can get them at any hardware store. Now this is why you want it thin. If your mixture is too thick, then you want to take another bucket and pour some of it off and then add water until it is milky, okay? It should not be thick. Otherwise, it's just going to gum this strainer bag up and it's not going to work. So these bags come with elastic. They're made to fit on a 5-gallon bucket, and the elastic holds them in place over the bucket. So it's real easy for a one-person operation to use these. With a little bit of labor, you can get most of the clay out real quick. Now I can feel through the bag that what's left in here is quite gritty. So I'm just going to turn this bag inside out. hook it over the original dirty bucket and run some water through it. And that's pretty much all there is to it. It's fairly clean now. I can just let it sit there and dry. And this is pure clay, although it's very watery. And it's going to take a while, now that we've added the water, to get it out of there to the point that we can actually make something out of this clay. So I'm going to let this sit here for an hour or so and settle. And the clay particles will slowly settle to the bottom, and I'll be able to pour clear water off the top. Then eventually it'll be thick enough for me to pour into a pillowcase and allow it to dry in the sun. So I'm going to let this set for a while, and I'll catch back up with you in an hour or two. All right, it's the next morning now, and the reason I didn't do it in a couple hours but waited all day was because this clay just wouldn't settle. And a lot of times you find that. It varies from clay to clay. Some clays will settle in like an hour, really fast, and other clays will take forever. Some of that has to do with the particle size and shape of the clay, and some of it has to do with the pH of the clay. I dumped a bunch of white vinegar in here about midday, and that is because sometimes if the pH is too basic, it'll somehow keep those particles from settling. And I don't know if the vinegar made a difference or not, because like I said, it's been almost 24 hours. But it has finally settled. You can see there's quite a bit of clear water on the top here. So I'm just going to pour off that clear water now so that I have the thicker settled clay at the bottom, and then I'm going to put that in a pillowcase and let it dry. Here's the other thing about these pillowcases. Sometimes the clay will settle so that it's heavy enough that it hardly passes through the pillowcase at all. And sometimes they will want to run clay through your pillowcase quite a bit. And so I'm worried about losing the clay that's actually running through it like a sieve. You can see it in here. I don't want to lose that. That's good clay. So I'm going to sit it in this shallow pan for a little while to let it dry that way. And then I can set it out in the sun and move it around a little bit more. Always try to get the heaviest quality cotton pillowcase you can find. If you get a pillowcase that's too thin or it's made out of nylon or something like that, then you're going to have more problems with the clay running through it. But a nice heavy cotton one is really the best. In an hour or so, I'm sure it'll dry up enough that I can start moving this around. And then while it dries, I'm going to flip it over from time to time so that it doesn't dry out on the top and stay gooey on the bottom. What I want is when I pull it out of that pillowcase, I want it to be a nice plastic mass that then I can knead that temper through. All right, so we'll catch up with this in a little while after I clean this clay off my face. Not leaking, well, at least not significantly. It's expected to be near 100 degrees today, so I imagine this will dry pretty quickly. I'll come out every once in a while, flip it over and check on it, and I'll get back with you when it's ready to go, and I'll show you how to put the temper in it. All right, another part of a day sitting in the sun, and this stuff is dried out. And here's really one of my problems with the wet processing is you're left with this lump that is too dry in some places and too wet in others. You've got to try to make it into a cohesive mass. There's a lot of kneading involved. It's just, this is the part where it becomes work. So here's where I'm at. You can see that it's really gooey in places, and then it's quite dry in others. So my goal at this point is to knead this into something cohesive. I will see what I can make of this. Once I get this all kneaded into one cohesive chunk, then I need to add temper. This is some ground pottery sherds that I pre-processed in preparation for this. Then I'm gonna be left kind of eyeballing and going, okay, about 20% of this is about this much ground sherds. So, and then I have to knead that all through the mass. So we'll see how this goes and how much clay I end up with. Okay, I think I've got this all fairly well processed. My first question is, it seems a lot browner than I expected. Looking at the original clay that I collected, it seems a lot lighter. So here is the material that I processed by hand through grinding. And I do think that it is a bit darker than this. Perhaps it was contaminated by the pillowcase. The pillowcase had been used to process brown and red clay in the past, and so it had a lot of chunks of it clinging to it, and it was in the fibers. So it's possible that some of that coloring seeped into the clay, and it can even pick up color from my workbench, which is used for brown clay quite a bit. So I was hoping for a light colored clay, and I end up with a fairly light brown colored clay. But it's really plastic. It feels nice. Of course, I haven't added any temper yet. So now I need to add the temper, and I need to estimate how much temper to add, which is really weird with wet processed clay. When I'm doing dry processing, it's real easy because I can just do scoops of the dry material, like 4 scoops of dry clay and 1 scoop of dry temper. Boom, I've got roughly 20%. But with wet clay, I don't see how I can measure it by volume. So it's always been, to me, just an eyeball it thing. So I look at this and I look at, how much would be maybe about a quarter of this. I don't know, not this whole thing, that's for sure. Like I said, there's got to be a more efficient way to do this. There's no doubt about it. Wet processing clay is a lot of work. If any of you have ideas for how this can be done more efficiently or faster, I am all ears. Leave those in the comments. I can't see doing enough of this for a whole class. It just looks like a lot of work. So I think I've got to figure out something. Either go ahead and bite the bullet and run it through my grinder. I feel like I lost a lot of clay through that pillowcase, dripping into the sidewalk, dripping into the dirt. It wanted to run through that really bad. And then the kneading, all the kneading and working with it after it's wet, I gotta do something different. I think this is really good clay, and I'm glad to have it. And I'm gonna use this in my next build for the Ancient Pottery Challenge. So I'm gonna build the Oya, and that's what I'm processing this block for. So look forward to that in coming days. If you're interested in the other side of this coin, the other way to process clay, the dry process, I'll put a link to that video right over here. All right, thanks for watching today. I'll catch you next time.